Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
And thank you, Adam, and welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham. We're coming at you nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, a city that just oozes memory and history. We got the Parliament buildings, you got the War Memorial, all the museums, and even now Victoria Island and the memories associated with that. And because of all this, we've decided to trek all the way down to Carleton University. And you know I'm not coming this far unless it's really important. So we're here talking to Jim Opp and John C. Walsh of Carleton University about their book, Placing Memory and Remembering Place in Canada. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks for doing this. I'm really excited about this because I just said to you guys a few minutes ago, I wrote a paper about collective memory when I was doing my MA, and it was really difficult for me to write because some of the concepts at the time I found really difficult to grasp, and going through this book helped really clarify a lot of these issues for me. But first off, let's just start. I mean, what's the broad framework of the book, and why did you want to put it together?
Well, there's a few reasons why we wanted to put the book together, because there's been a lot of work on memory that's come out in the last decade, 12 years maybe, starting, I guess, with Ian Mackay maybe, and The Quest for the Folk was one of the first that really put memory on center stage for Canadian historians and has really sort of expanded from there. One of the interesting things about Ian's book is it's very much based on a regional notion of memory and the invention of the folk. But a lot of the work that's come out since then has been so focused on this sort of Pierre Nora's version of sites of memory that the national framework for understanding memory has become very dominant. And one of the real impulses for the book was to really kind of step back from the national framework and say, well, what's going on at the local level in terms of memory? And especially when you're thinking in terms of questions of space and place, we wanted to really sort of rethink the strong national narrative. And it's John's fault that we did the book, because he's the one who
it often is.
He's the one who really sort of pushed this concept that, you know, we needed to do this now, and we needed to do this in a particular way, rethinking place.
Yeah, I think there's the scholarly side of it and the intellectual side of it that in terms of the literature that Jim's mapped out, and I also think it's this issue of belonging, and it's the notion of belonging to something beyond the self. It's a question that I've been interested in for a long time, and one of the things that really struck me about the memory studies literature is that the question of belonging is fundamental, right? Who belongs to the imagined community of the nation, in Anderson's sort of ubiquitous phrasing and influential phrasing. But one of the things that struck me, and it was something that I was working out in some research questions, was the ways in which people's notions of belonging, feeling that sense of belonging to a community, was also fundamental to their everyday experiences, and in a much more, not just localized, but at a different scale than the nation, that these bonds of belonging incorporated family and kinship and community that was, in some cases, very localized in place, in some cases stretched a great distance, but actually was incidentally connected to questions of the nation. And I just wondered where those people belonged and where their notions of memory fit into the literature. And both Jim and I just didn't really see much in the literature that was doing it at that time.
And one of the critiques of the whole rise of the memory studies field broadly internationally has been that it has tended to reify the nation instead of actually questioning it. So we really want to approach it through the lens of place and space as a way to sort of move it away from the abstract notion of the nation and national memory as if there's one national memory that everybody can buy into, and get into the more complex layers of memory that are more contested at the local level.
And so a major component of that is obviously place. And the book makes, in pretty much every chapter, discusses what is place and how do we define place and how it changes over time. So I'll just pose the question, what is place?
The cheap definition, the good one-sentence definition, is place is space made meaningful. We think it's an evocative, but maybe somewhat ambiguous phrasing, but it's meant to distinguish, and this is a big debate among geographers and others, what is the relationship between space and place. And Jim and I certainly read deeply and widely into those debates. While all of them had different sort of specific takes on the question, a lot of it seemed to come back to this notion of that place emerges and place is made as the sort of byproduct of people's social and spatial relationships. The sort of conflicts or the intersections of spaces. For us, that phrase, place made space meaningful, also made possible for our collaborators, no matter what they were doing, to use that phrase, to think through that phrase and how it applied to a story they wanted to tell or an archive that they were already working in. I mean, one of the things about the book that we were so excited about, and people responded so enthusiastically to our invitations to join it, is that in some cases we challenged people who were already working in memory studies to work differently. And we were challenging people working on place to work differently a little bit. And by being together, by coming together and giving them a sort of some central ideas to kick around within their own sort of sandbox, we're pretty excited about how we found this way to all talk to each other, starting from that standpoint.
And it's one of the reasons why we chose the title we did is because we wanted to make placing and remembering both active verbs. We wanted to make those processes, and that place isn't just a thing, but it's something that's in process, as that quote you quoted from suggests. And so if remembering is a process and people grasp that part of it as being a process, we wanted to sort of connect that to placing as in placemaking and constructions of places being just as actively in process in a sense of being and belonging. Yeah.
So as the place then changes over time, is it affected by the events or the people or the communities and the kids? I'm assuming, obviously, there's no one specific thing that changes the place. But how do we identify then how it changes?
I'm not sure if there is one way to identify how a place changes, because if place is space being made meaningful, then it's how do your memories change as much as anything, right? How does your understanding of this place change in terms of how do human interactions with the place changes, in terms of either how it's represented or experienced or made to be boundaried in a particular way. So it's your relationship to that space that's changing, because that's what's defining it as place, right, for a community or for a group.
So as the meaning then changes, then the place would change as well.
Places, as abstract as physical spaces, there's no doubt that Matthew Evenden's chapter about the damming up in the Lake Minnewaca, submerging places underwater. I mean, there's a change that happens, there's no doubt, and that is going to change then how people relate to that space, because now all of a sudden you're not launching boats from that landing. Now you're scuba diving down into the area and trying to look at the ruins. So there's no doubt that there's a physicality to these spaces that we're talking about. But I think that's less of our concern than it is the bonds of which those physical spaces mean in terms of our meanings that we attach to it.
And I think that's an important distinction, because I think places structurally change, right? Political economy, questions of assembly, disassembly, the physicality of place. But we're so interested in the sort of ways in which the social relationships. I mean, we do come from this as social and cultural historians. That's sort of our starting place. And so that phrase about place as space made meaningful, that meaning is so deeply embedded in social and cultural events and processes and happenings, that one of the things that we find so compelling is that, and so important to explore, is that why do people still feel a sense of connectedness to a place that no longer exists, for example? There just didn't seem to be much room in some of the historical literature for understanding the answer to that question. And for us, part of the answer lies up in exploring people's memories and senses of attachment, senses of place, and that takes us back into people and back into memories.
Yeah, because I told you guys this story just before we started recording, but I was in Boston a few years ago, and we went to like a meeting house, and they said this is where the founding fathers met, all this stuff. But then she talked about how it had been renovated 18 times in the 200 years in between, and I thought to myself, well, this isn't really the same place, and so it changed how I thought of it, and it changed my connection to the place. But then we went to Fenway Park, and while Fenway Park has been renovated, the stadium, like the field itself, is the same. So I would look and I'd be like, well, David Ortiz is standing in the same batter's box where Ted Williams stood. And to me, that was a lot cooler than being in this house that had been rebuilt and there was a subway station below it. I mean, that on its own just really took that away from me.
But I'm wondering if this is a case where you had you been to Fenway before?
No.
But you had already seen Fenway through television, through images, and your relationship to Fenway began before you got there. I would suggest, without analyzing you here in the spot, although I'm willing to do that, is that you already had a set of expectations about what that place would be, and I think it's also something about the context of your encounter with that place. Right? You went to a place that designates itself as a historic site. right? And you as a historian already brought with you a tinge of skepticism about the authenticity, and so you're very keen to see those layers, right? But others there who might have less experience, that veneer may not have affected their
or the meaning of the 19th century people who rebuilt the meeting house, right? Or what they are attaching to it in creating a historic site tells us something about what they're considering to be important for the particular stories they're telling about this place.
Right.
Whereas in your experience, again, it's interesting. What qualifies as authentic is a big question, right? And that gets into some interesting territory of what is authentic to place. For you, is it that spot? For others, would it be if you had the original seats at Fenway Park, but somewhere else in the museum? Well, what then is the more authentic experience? Having the original seats or having the original field, right? And so why do we let the GPS coordinates determine our most authentic point?
Yeah. Right. So then, if the meaning then for each thing is going to be different for individuals, then how can collective memories be constructed?
Yeah.
Well, we try to really frame the book around the notion of public memory, right? Mm-hmm. And collective memory is definitely associated with public memory, but it's not necessarily the same thing, because we wanted to sort of make this to get around the whole issue of memory being such a amorphous field. When you start getting into individual memories and the psychology of memory and all those kinds of layers, it can get very complicated and unmanageable right away. But we wanted to sort of look at, what are public expressions of memory, and how do they say something about what a community decides to define as place, about what's worth remembering about a place, how they build notions of place, whether through commemorations or through other kinds of vernacular notions of memory and expressions of memory. So we tried to do it as a kind of, to get around that question of every person has a different understanding or a different sense of place. It's, what is then being expressed in these sort of public communal kinds of ways?
The important thing, too, that these expressions of collectivity doesn't mean it's sort of unanimous or the community necessarily is consent, right? One of the things that each of the chapters tries to emphasize is the importance of struggle and the power relationships that exist. That who gets to speak for a public, right? Who gets to so going back to that issue of belonging is also the issue of who gets to kind of speak for and represent and document.
Yes. And so Cecilia Morgan's chapter is, I think, the good example of that, of sort of First Nations wanting to have a voice in these official commemorations, trying to carve out a space within what would normally be seen as very sort of settler-dominated kinds of narratives, seeing that they have to get their voice in there in terms of marking out their own territory, so to speak, in a commemoration landscape.
And being unable to do so because Edwin Moses is such a polarizing figure who...
Within the community.
Six Nations, there's no
that.
Single voice coming from Six Nations. And that's one of the nice things that Cecilia shows us, is just how even those assumptions of Aboriginal and settler as sort of static, stable categories that we can then talk about break down when you actually start looking at the specifics, that these things, categories, are as unstable as people like Anne Lohr-Stoller were suggesting years ago.
Well, what about something like Remembrance Day as a major public commemoration? And it seems as though it has one narrative, and there's no conflicting narratives allowed, otherwise you're being disrespectful. And there's certainly a political undertone to that everyone has to follow this one story. And you're talking about trying to get different points of view or different memories in there. I mean, how do non-dominant narratives get included in public commemoration or public memory?
That's a good question. I mean, we frame Remembrance Day as a national ceremony, and because we always have the cameras here at the War Memorial and Elgin Street in Ottawa, it becomes a very national event. But anybody who's done work on the history of the cenotaphs in local communities know it's a very localized story. And it becomes a kind of interesting story on a very local level in terms of whose names are getting representative, who participates at a local level, and the different kinds of stories that get told around that. And so I come from a very mixed community in southern Alberta, and there were stories told of the ones who ran to the hills instead of being conscripted, right? And so I think that I don't know how, it's the challenge of historians to find the contested stories that challenge the dominant narratives, and to see, what fissures, what fractures exist in those dominant narratives that get handed down. But I think they're there. It's just a matter of also looking at the silences as well as the presences, right?
Yeah.
I also think, too, to bring the story back to Ottawa a little bit, is that you see, one of the things, the site itself, the cenotaph has a history, right? It's changed over time, and some of its most recent changes have to do with the addition of those sort of totemic figures from Canada's military past. And it seems like French and English and Aboriginal and everybody's represented. And I think that's one of the things that becomes important for us as historians and for scholars and for teachers is to call attention to the fact that while the site is supposed to speak for some sort of eternal sense of connectedness and emotion and these sorts of things, there's a reason why that site has changed over time, is that there are these moments where the public culture insists that what we're going to remember and how we're going to remember is going to have to change. Asking this question right now is, of course, a really poignant and difficult thing to answer without going on a 20-minute sidebar. But it's clear, there's nothing new about the politics of Remembrance Day. I mean, the politics of Remembrance Day began from its very first iteration. Yeah. And I think one of the ways in which subaltern groups and groups who have been pushed to the margins is to be engaged and to continue to struggle and to find other ways and to do so in a way that is as much as possible is a constructive, because we've seen what happened when there's an effort to engage in a way that's more destructive. It just doesn't go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And because we talk about this at the local level then in Ottawa, another example that I thought of was New Orleans and how New Orleans has changed since 2005, I think it was when the hurricane was. And we can see the images on TV and see how the city has changed, but unless you're there locally, your conception is going to be completely different. And your memory of the city before, after, and then when you go to the place, like obviously a physical change, but then the emotional change that went through everyone in the city. So, how does that local component and the experience of being local change someone's understanding of place? Like, do you have to be necessarily from a place to truly understand it, or can I, as an outsider, just come and see it and really appreciate it for what it is?
I don't know if you can set up a kind of hierarchy of knowledge around place in terms of who understands it more, but there's no question that being local and inhabiting local spaces is a different perspective than from being away. And I guess my chapter goes into that a little bit. I'm talking about sort of photographic representations of place that are at once drawing upon a kind of universal or global aesthetic of what is wildlife photography in the 1970s and 1980s, and yet at the same time being experienced, being knowledgeable about the landscape in a different way, right? Mm-hmm. That having lived there, having experienced there, having these sort of routine trips through the Southern Alberta foothills, it's saying something else beyond just a kind of aspiration to being a generic wildlife photographer, right? And so there's knowledges of those spaces that are localized that I think that are meaningful in some interesting ways.
But I think, like all epistemologies, they can be learned, and I think that this is where the question, and this is part of the politics of place making, right? Is who gets to be of place and who isn't. Right. And I think even learning, for example, the vernacular everyday names given to streets or neighborhoods, beyond those are on the map, right? There's the formal map, and then there's the other map, the social map of a place. And I think it's that social map where a lot of this stuff is being worked out. And so I agree with Jim that this is very much a sort of knowledge, and that there isn't a hierarchy of knowledge. I think one of the things the book is really pushing back against is thinking about as a hierarchy of knowledge of place that is from the sort of top down, and that there's good knowledges, there's authentic knowledges, and then there's these other localized, fuzzy, or mythical, romantic, nostalgic knowledges, as if they are untrue by their very categorization, as opposed to seeing these as competing knowledges, right? Competing ways of knowing. But I do think, to bring it back to the case of New Orleans, given the Super Bowl, it's a timely example, is that there is these opportunities to learn and to acquire these epistemologies, and that comes from being engaged in place, right? It comes from sort of turning yourself over a little bit to place.
But can you do that? I do wonder if you can do that without being there, right? Yeah. I mean, I do think that there's a sense of geographical knowledge that only comes from being in place, and that being from afar, you can't just sort of, I don't think you can completely understand that sense of meaning of place without having actually been there. And so there is a distancing there, but I don't. At the same time, you don't want to essentialize that knowledge either, right?
There's a wonderful book by Keith Basso called "Wisdom Sits in Places," and it's one of the books that certainly Jim and I had, sort of on the edge of our desks as we were talking about this project and writing the introduction. And Basso spent years and years as an ethnographer, literally and he tells a story about just being in the community, being just doing everyday things. Going for trips, going for walks, not conducting research, but doing just what Jim said, being in place. And in earning the trust that he wasn't trying to extract knowledge so he could advance his academic career, but was generally just wanted to be, an understanding of why they had this relationship to place. Basso was able to learn what this sort of other geographies were, these ways of naming places, the kind of storytelling that was being done of places. It's not short term. It's a long process, and it requires a great deal of trust, and you have to earn that, I think. And this comes from people moving into neighborhoods as much as it does researchers going in and doing what it is we do. And I do think Basso's book is a real sort of an important example of how those epistemologies can be not just obtained but also earned.
But then, Jim, your article focuses on photographs and photographs of the foothills in Alberta, and then how do you get the same appreciation through the photographs, or are you trying to see it through the eyes of the photographer?
Well, I think one of the arguments I'm trying to make in my piece is that from the view of these camera clubs that were set up in the 60s and 70s, the act of photography with the kind of technology that they were using at the time really required you to look at the landscape in a particular way. And it required that you frame it according to certain rules and codes and regulations, and to try to develop a kind of aesthetic of the wilderness that was both amateur and yet borderline professional in terms of what they were doing. And so I try to sort of play with the divisions within the town that I grew up in between the farming and the ranching, and the sort of why the photographers always move west, why they always go to the foothills, why do you always look at these landscapes instead of the more what would be seen as more modern landscapes. That would be the farming agricultural side. And on the one hand, there's a kind of aesthetic that they're aspiring to that would be a kind of what's going on in the 1970s. But on the other hand, one of the things I argue is that without that local knowledge of place, they would not have gotten those shots. They would not have found those places. There's a kind of routineness of being in those places and picture taking over many seasons, over many years, that gives you a sense of the landscape that wouldn't have been possible. And so on the one hand, there's getting these shots that are appealing to an aesthetic. On the other hand, they wouldn't have gotten those shots without that local knowledge. Okay. So there's that local and the wider artistic side of it that's going on. And then what I think I try to do, or I hope I do towards the end of the article, is then I revisit the archive of these photographs that were in my parents' basement and look at it from more of a stake of the memory questions as well as the sort of questions of place from where they're situated in a place that's changing, in a kind of farm community that's undergoing its own stresses, the sort of the withdrawal of railroads from prairie towns, all the things that are changing with dams in the area, the kind of intrusions that you don't see in the picture but you see at the frames. And those pictures can come to stand for something else. And I don't think my parents would ever see their work as explicitly political, but I think there is a political side to holding on to those particular landscapes.
And John, your article similarly talks about changing landscape and the political nature of it. You're talking about the Ottawa Valley. And you're talking about how the dominant narrative, I guess, has changed from an Aboriginal one to a more European one. So how did that process occur?
In the Ottawa Valley?
Yeah.
One of the things that sort of prefaces the story I'm telling is the sort of larger structural change in place in the Ottawa Valley, and that is it's really important move from being a geography of destination for settlers to being a point of departure. And that's why I start the chapter with the story of the train station, of the people coming to the trains, throwing their belongings and going to the next promise of Eden, the one in the prairies that Doug Horton wrote about so many years ago, and this kind of notion of going west, right? And one of the things that really struck me was why after those people left, what what happened to the people behind. So many of the narratives we tell in Canadian history, right, follow the moving west, right? That's the story. That's the narrative. That's the national narrative.
Yeah.
Right? The east to west, the great Canadian narrative. And by staying with the people on the platforms, one of the things that sort of jumped off the page to me pretty quickly was how they, within a decade, started organizing homecoming festivals for the very people that left. And one of the things that struck me is that here they are sort of welcoming back those who left, and those who left because they couldn't stay. And so there's a whole strange dynamic at play sort of going around. But one of the things that didn't change over time was the systematic kind of ways that their whole understanding of place, the stories that they told about place, the stories they told themselves about themselves when they were welcoming back those who had left and those who were just interested in coming for a nice tourist weekend, made very little room for anything but a sort of settler narrative in terms of arrival and transformation and so forth. But this theme of persistence is an interesting silence in those stories that they told in those homecoming festivals and historical pageants and written histories and museum displays and all the different things that they did. Is that the role of Aboriginal peoples is sort of is that standard thing that they're there at the time of arrival. They just disappear from the narrative, and yet they have to confront the reality at some point that they're still there, whether it's on the reserve at Golden Lake or living off reserve in the very towns that are celebrating these homecoming festivals. And what becomes really apparent over the first half of the 20th century is the degree to which it's a story not of dispossession. It's never a story of dispossession, but it's a story of sometimes noble absence, right? So you have a cover like the Pembroke Centenary of 1920, which has on the cover this Aboriginal woman just drifting down the river away from town, right? She's moving off in a direction somewhere away from town. And the romance and the nostalgia of that figure is that she represents that sort of early beginnings, but certainly not part of the story that they wanted to tell anymore. And there is no effort to reconcile. There is no effort. When Aboriginals appear, in some cases it's white kids dressed up as young, native boys or girls and performing. Or in the case of historical pageantry, the role of Aboriginals is there for the first arrivals and then to get out of the way. And so what gets documented, for example, are the stories of the first white baby born in town or this sort of thing. And the reason some of the stuff I think lingers well into our own present, of course, is that it doesn't make room in the historical imaginations of those attending these festivals to think of a past in which Aboriginal peoples are an active component of it. They are either silent or they are certainly marginal figures. And because those early histories become written down, they get told in schools, they get told within families, you have generations that are raised on these same stories, and it becomes very difficult to find a different kind of narrative.
And so that could help account, at least in part, for part of the I Don't Know More, is that it's trying to reassert their place in the story and trying to assert their memory and their agency, I guess, for lack of a better word, and that has been systematically just reduced or taken away from.
Sure. And the fact that it's at Victoria Island is not incidental or accidental. The geography of Victoria Island, literally at the foot of Parliament Hill and really, in the Ottawa River, at the very moment. The fact that we're on the cusp of the 400th anniversary of Champlain arriving right here in town, and things are ramping up here in Ottawa in terms of commemorating this 400th anniversary. Victoria Island is going to play a very important and powerful role because it is a land claim that remains unresolved. It remains in the courts. And yet for non-Aboriginal peoples in particular, one of the things that you see in those comment threads on CBC or the Globe and Mail is why do they think they have a claim to what is clearly part of the capital, right? Don't Aboriginal peoples belong on reserves, right? Outside the cities and certainly outside the capital. And I think the geography of Victoria Island is really important to what's been happening with Idle Moor. And Chief Spence certainly knew and appreciated what that geography meant to the larger struggle that she's engaged in.
Yeah. But that also brings us back to another issue then, is this conflicting narrative of Aboriginal people versus maybe a more national narrative, if that exists. I mean, so that begs the question of, is national memory even possible? Or is it simply a collection of localized memories that, maybe take what they want from a larger story? Is it possible to have a national narrative, a unified national narrative?
I'm not sure if if we ever had a unified national narrative in the sense of a common memory in that term. There's always been national narratives presented of varying degrees of varying sizes, right? And I'm not sure if we even have to sort of look at only the Aboriginal issue being the one that's been the one that's sort of fracturing that narrative. It's certainly an important one that definitely shows the problems of trying to position a national narrative, such as all you have to do is look at the reaction to the renaming of the Museum of Civilization as a post-Confederation history museum, and look at who that is excluding, and that creates all kinds of serious issues. But I think that from the moment people started writing regional histories, from the people, even before there's a kind of social history component to questioning national narratives written from a very political perspective, you can look at W.L. Morton as somebody who's questioning a national narrative and repositioning, well, where's the center of our history? Where do we write from? In a sense, Canada never has had that core national narrative that has grabbed hold of it in quite the same way, if for no other reason than the French-Canadian fact has always complicated it, right? I mean, there's always been a kind of multi-levels to questions of identity between Aboriginal, between English, between French, and between other collective groups. So I'm not sure if you can say that the national narrative is always made up of a bunch of localities, because it sounds too much like a building block kind of Lego approach. Right. That if we just add up enough Lego pieces, somehow we'll have a national narrative. And it doesn't work when you've got... clearly I have young kids, because my analogy is Lego and Tinker Toys and Matchbox cars. They just don't work together, right? No matter how hard you try to make them work together. But this is why it's funny. The Canadian national narrative has, in a sense, since the 1920s, when the Group 7 was struggling with this whole issue, what have they done? They've gone back to place, in a sense of constructing Canada as a wilderness, trying to come up with a kind of geographical understanding that could somehow lead these sort of political divisions or these other kinds of divisions within the population. And that's great, except the only problem is, of course, they produced landscapes that didn't have people in them as a way to get around that issue. And I guess we wanted to sort of take a similar step in putting place back into the story, but with people in it, and it's people's understanding of place that matter. And I think we really... The national side of things isn't completely absent, even in our book. And when the article by Johnston and Ripmeester about the landscapes in Niagara Falls around commemorations and the sort of layers of commemorations, you have the federal government commemorating some things, you have local commemorations, you have the provincial commemorations, and 3 different plaques on one building, right, trying to sort of claim their part of the story. I think that you can sort of see that, in fact, on the public level of memory, there's the national inserts itself in various ways, but it's not defining what's the most important thing for the local identity or local relationship to place.
Because I was talking on a podcast we just did recently. I was talking with Tim Stanley, and we were talking about the segregation of Chinese kids in Victoria. And one of the things that we got to talking about was that the school strike in 1922, 1923 was something that I hadn't heard about until I read his book. And, it brought up this issue of, even though we teach Canadian history, I grew up in Ontario. I did my MA in Saskatchewan, so I know a lot of Ontario, Saskatchewan history. Now being in Ottawa, I know some Francophone history as well. But the East Coast and West Coast is completely lost on me, for the most part, in terms of those local histories. And for the national history that we get, at least that I grew up with, it was Ontario. It was like War of 1812, Lower Seacord, the Loyalists, and all this stuff. And that raises, it strikes me as it's part of this deconstructing of the nation states. That, can it really exist if we don't have a unified narrative, if that's impossible, and if trying to accomplish that just leads to further division or further tensions, because inevitably you have to exclude somebody to do it.
I wish it was because we were deconstructing the nation state, but my suspicion is the reason there's so many different stories is simply because education is a provincial domain. And provincial domain the provincial curriculum for education is so varied across the country that there is no teaching of a national, or a very limited notion of national Canadian history, or when you teach Canadian history, or what grade you get Canadian history. I mean, my social studies growing up in Alberta in the 80s, it was all about, I was in the Cold War, so it was about Russia and the Soviet Union, and that was much more important history than the Canadian stuff at that time. So I think that it would be nice if the education system looked at the nation as a constructed entity and engaged with it more. But my suspicion is that, in fact, what's increasingly becoming common is a focus on a couple of key events which seem to stand for all of Canadian history in a way that's really unquestioned. So whether it's Vimy Ridge or whether it's very sort of key elements in the case that's rebranding of the War of 1812 as somehow bringing the whole nation together, which causes there's a very problematic narrative, to say the least. I wish we were seeing more of what you were suggesting, but I don't think we are.
The one wonders too if part of the impulse was to return Canada to history, by which I mean to ask the question, what did Canada mean to people historically? What did it mean to people in 1867? What did it mean to people in 1885? Where was Canada? Even doing that standard first-year introduction to Canadian history thing, which is to put up these various maps of Canada, and every decent survey textbook has it, right? It's full of maps, in part because the question, where is Canada, is itself profoundly historical. Something that the people of Nunavut and even the people of Newfoundland certainly don't need reminding of, and yet people growing up in southern Ontario, like I did, need constant reminders. And I think that's one of the ways in which, even in the public school system and certainly at the university level, if rather than seeing and looking for those moments where Canada emerged, but instead changing the question a little bit to say, where was Canada? When was Canada? Why Canada? I think that those questions can be talked about within the local in all sorts of ways. Because one of the things when we talk about these local commemorations, one of the things that is really interesting when you look at what local museums have done historically, what local historical societies do, they're always interested in celebrating and commemorating national moments. But it's about trying to explain, often to themselves. The story they want to tell themselves isn't about the nation, but it's about the relationship of the people in that place to the nation. So their service in a war, or the ways in which their foundries contributed to the manufacturing of certain armaments, or whatever the story is. And I think that for us is perhaps the more compelling thing. Not what is the national, but what does the nation mean to people, and how has it been part of this bundle of memories that they have that are held in place. And this is the other very sort of social history part of our project, is that memory is so disembodied, right? It's this thing that floats, it exists in our consciousness, and yet it's not just in social relationships, but it takes these material forms, right? In these monuments, and in these buildings, and in these photographs, and in these postcards, and the various other types of things that you see in the book. And I think that's one of the places that you can see lots of evidence of the nation, but as being part of this larger bundle of place memories and place experiences.
I have a quote from the introduction that I want to read. Quote, "We must accept that places and memories are always in a state of becoming, of being worked on, struggled over, celebrated, mourned, and even, it bears repeating, ignored." Now, I wonder, does this apply to all places and things, and like even stuff that maybe we don't consciously remember? Like the example I'll use is that you go to the grocery store, and that's not something that you remember. It's just something you do in a place that you go. So is that constantly being worked on and struggled over, or is it maybe larger issues that relate to sort of more how we live or what's important to us?
I think in the framework of our book, this is one of the reasons why we were focusing on public memories, right? And in a sense of your individual memory of going to the store is not going to be a very contested one, other than how communities, how groups, how people understand or commemorate or relate to their place. That part is always in a state of becoming, and always in a state of contestation, of having to be either reinforced or ignored or reworked into new ways as the context changes, right? As life changes, as these communities change or deal with circumstances. So
like when there's only one grocery store in the neighborhood, So when they build another grocery store, then my conception of the one grocery store will now change, right? Probably.
Yeah, I mean, your memory of those store. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting. I'll take your grocery store memory.
I bring up the grocery store because I'm bitter at it. I hate that it's the only one in the neighborhood. It bothers me.
No, but I'll turn it back into my local town. I mean, my mother always used to buy locally, and she would know the local grocery stores so well that she would buy her produce at this one and her meat at this one and so and so on this one. Now they drive 45 minutes to get their produce from Lethbridge, simply for the fact that they are so underserved by all of the two remaining grocery stores in town in terms of getting the last of the vegetables. They don't bring in this, they don't bring in that, they don't bring in this. So their landscape and mobility and their connection to the community is really challenged by that. They don't want to do that, but their sense of loyalty to that is at a certain point is then pulled into those bigger orbits of the bigger city. And so they lament what they used to be able to do in town. They lament that there used to be a more equal equation of distribution of goods and services. Right. And I think small towns in general are feeling this sense that they're not keeping up with the big cities in terms of even those kinds of basic services. Mm-hmm. And so there's a familiar kind of memory that is happening. Right. That's not necessarily a public memory and something that's been officially commemorated in our and we hate the grocery store day or anything like that. But
I will found that day.
Yeah,
that sounds awful.
But I mean, you can see that in Francis Sripa's work around Jasper Avenue and the rise and fall of Jasper Avenue as a site of commemoration. Right, that as the city's changed, as the outline of the city has changed, as the transportation networks have changed, the meaning of Jasper Avenue as the place to make a mark, as the place to make a statement either for or against something, it starts to lose its relevance. And so you start to see the city shape itself around White Avenue as a more appropriate space of commemoration than around Jasper Avenue. And so you do see those changes taking place, but it's more about that sort of making a public statement about a particular place or a memory of place than it is about that kind of individual struggle.
But I think here too, Stephen Hye's, powerful story about what happens when a geography is unmade, right? And this has obvious parallels with some of the Africville work that has been done, particularly in the last few years by scholars. But the story he tells about what happens when that routine of going to work is more than just losing a job, right? And Steve has been telling us these stories for a while and sharing stories of those who have been displaced for a while with us. But one of the things that's so interesting about Sturgeon and about the Mill History Binder in particular is that not only is there this sort of expressed through interviews this sense of loss about attachment to where they went to work and how it's a big part of their identity, their ability to provide for families, and those sorts of stories, but also this effort to kind of document that history, right, in that binder. And that story, the stories he tells in there about how carefully assembled those binders are, how guarded, how policed they are, and is something that speaks that it isn't just that these senses of attachment, these senses of loss aren't just sort of expressed emotionally, but take on a form. People express these in very specific ways, and that Mill History Binder has that thingness I was alluding to earlier about memories take form. They appear, and they have to. And if they don't, they'll get lost, quite honestly, through the fabrics of these things. But, go back to Francis's piece for a second, the earlier question about the nation. I mean, that's what Jasper is all about, right? Is Edmontonians making claims about Canadianness and Britishness, right? It's all about nation and empire. And the fact that those celebrations of nation and empire had a geography is one of the fundamental points she's making. And why it was there and then why it moved and what were the implications of that relocation. So even things like the nation are commemorated somewhere.
Right. Another quote is, if we are to reflect on and remake ourselves, it is vital that we reconsider our own memories of place and the emplacement of memory. We have two examples, say the binder, that's maybe a conscious effort on the part of the workers, but Jasper Avenue, that may be unconscious, and it's just day to day that it gets reshaped. But if we're to reflect on it, how do we do it? Do we do it consciously in the moment, or do we do it afterwards, or is it just an unconscious thing?
Well, I think it is. I don't know about day-to-day living, but I think that there's a conscious effort that as we come to understand places as contested, as we come to understand places as having multiple voices, that there aren't just one singular thing, then that's something that we have to sort of try to engage with and come to terms with. And I think, if we go back to pieces in the book, Patricia Gentili's piece around the sort of queer geography of Ottawa, and sort of revisiting these spaces, which are such monumental spaces, tourist spaces, spaces of politics in Ottawa, and then revisit them along the lines of, well, what does it mean for the queer community to move through these spaces, to meet up in certain spaces, to be forced out of other spaces in the light of the Cold War, in the light of all of these security state and surveillance. I think it localizes Ottawa. It takes Ottawa out of that always constant national framework, but it also gives you a sense of a different relationship with space and place for the queer community that normally those outside of that community wouldn't see, right? And making it visible, making it acknowledgeable, and trying to find a way for those voices to find a space in the commemoration of those spaces is important. And I think for Patricia, doing the oral interviews and telling those stories is the first step of making that space much more visible, and especially in a place like Ottawa, which doesn't have, as she points out, Ottawa doesn't have a clearly defined gay community in the same way that Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver do, right? There's sort of a gay village style doesn't apply as well to Ottawa as much as they've been trying. But the geography in part works against it. And so this is how do you maintain that sort of contested notion of place without necessarily the same kind of visible signs of it, right?
I think, when you write books and you give lectures and you give talks and you do these sorts of things, for me, if the one thing I can affect is that I raise for somebody to question what it is they see when they're looking at something, then I think the book or the article or the lecture has worked. And I think when you put together a book like this, as much as these specific places, and these stories are very localized, right? We are talking about very specific places in Canada. But I think you do a book like this in the hopes that it raises that questioning for people, that what is it they're seeing when they look at the Lord Elgin Hotel in Ottawa? What is it that they're hearing when they listen at a Remembrance Day ceremony? And it's not to turn everybody into overly self-reflexive deconstructionists, but it is simply to encourage them to question and to think about and I guess to be reflexive about what it is they see when they're looking at something, and what it is they're hearing when they're listening. And so when a book is swinging for the fences and a lecture is swinging for the fences, that's kind of what you're hoping to do beyond the specifics, right?
Nice use of a baseball analogy to suck up to the interviewer.
Listen, I'm still trying to get over the David Ortiz and Ted Williams.
So the book, we've touched on it a little bit. It's a collaborative piece. Did you guys want to talk a little bit about working as a collaboration and sort of the challenges? And obviously, there's benefits to it as well. Is it a fun process or?
Yes.
Silence.
Yes. No, I cannot. So when I was not to take it back to Ottawa U, let you go back down the canal for a moment. When I did my MA, Chad Gaffield had and has an immense influence over how I think about academic work and scholarly work, and beyond the specifics of the intellectual side of it, but the sort of social and political side of what we do. And one of the things, coming particularly from someone who played a lot of sports too, one of the things I really lamented about academic life as I was exploring it in graduate school was how solitary and individualistic it was. And one of the things that Chad introduced me to with his work with Quebec scholars was working collaboratively. He was working on the history of the Outaouais book at that time, and there was a series of regional histories done in Quebec in the 90s. They're really wonderful books, and they were all team written. People are assigned different eras or different parts of the region, and they wrote. And Chad was doing the Outaouais book, and I sort of had this front row seat to that process. And one of the things that excited me about it was that they were constantly getting together to talk about the work they were doing. They were actually sitting around a table not unlike this, talking to one another and working collaboratively. And one of the things that we were so fortunate with this book wasn't that we just solicited people to write things and they sent it. We brought everyone to Ottawa for 2 days, and we had pre-circulated everyone's chapters, and we sat around this wonderful table with food and drink, and we just spent almost 36 straight hours, it felt like, together, not talking about the project when it was appropriate, but also just being together, and that sense of collaboration and forging these relationships with our collaborators is something that, as many times as I can do this in my career, I would certainly do. I mean, I just think there's something really exciting when you bring together, particularly a book like this, which brought together people who might otherwise not have the opportunity to collaborate. Geographers, sociologists, people from communication, people from history. To work together like this is for me, was still a really exciting part of the experience.
A shout out to Chad Gatfield and the Shirkway to Workshops Grant.
Listen, I'm not foolish.
And all right, that's great. And so your new projects, guys, so Jim, you're working on a Rideau Timescapes app.
It's done.
It's done. Is it up? It's running?
The Rideau Timescapes app is available on your favorite iDevice, iPod, iPad, iPhone, and it's download for free. Just search for it on the Apple Store, the Rideau Timescapes app.
Very nice. And it's
part
of the canal?
Yeah, what it is it delivers historical photographs of the Rideau Canal to you as you go along. And so it maps out the canal, and it maps out the different lock stations along the canal. And each lock station has a little history of each of the lock stations, and you get a sort of map view of different places where photographs have been taken. And so when you download the photograph, you can layer the photograph on top of the view in front of you, or you can look at zoom in on the photograph, or look at stacks of photographs that changes over time. So,
that's cool.
Yeah.
And then the other one you had is Capturing Faith, Yusuf Karsh, and the photographic representation of religion.
That is what I'm supposed to be working on right now, and working on research for that project as well. Yeah.
Very nice. And John, your new project, Landscapes of Longing, Colonizing Space and Society.
I'm laughing new. It is the book that will not end. Yeah. So the stuff in Placing Memory actually comes from the last chapter of that book, and that was what really struck me was when I was doing the historiography chapters, we always do with graduate students. Yeah. Right, that is something that always begins at the sort of start of a thesis. Right here are the different fields. These are different people who have studied my topic, and here's how I'm different. One of the things about Landscapes of Longing is I realized as I've been working on this book is that chapter has to come at the end. That the stories that have been told about the sort of arrival of settlers and this transformation in the landscape and the forging of these local places, that the stories that we told about that is actually part of the very story itself. Right. And rather than sort of foregrounding, all these histories of this colonization project in the 19th century and what scholars have found, it became increasingly obvious to me that is an active part of the very story itself and needs to be at the end. And me working that out is really what's part and parcel of what's going on here. But the other project that I'm really excited about and that is tied to the conversation today is one I'll be doing in the classroom, starting in the classroom next year. And that is an oral history project here in Ottawa in which we're going to be talking to people who grew up around Carleton and asking them to share with us their experiences of growing up in Ottawa. And in particular, not just their relationship to the university, although that'll be part of what we're doing, but to also do things like to draw us maps of their childhoods. So where they, what places they remember and so forth and what was important to them. And depending on the weather, when we can do some of these first interviews, is doing walking interviews with them to as a way to kind of to get out of the living room, to get out of the sort of static interview, and to make it mobile, like so much of our relationships in place are. And I'll be doing this with students, and this is part of a larger project that's continuing along this vein of place memories and making it again a somewhat local project.
Very nice. Mm-hmm. I like that. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this, guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. So that's Jim Opp and John Walsh from Carleton University. If you have any questions, comments about this podcast or any podcast in general, you can find me at historyslam@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Shawnee Fever. Don't you guys use Twitter?
Yes.
Yeah?
At Prof. Walsh 2003.
And
the CCPH has a Twitter feed, but I don't remember it exactly right now.
I'll find it and link it up. So you can find it on Twitter as well. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.